John chapter 6 is where we're going to be this morning. So good to be back with you. Had a great trip to Ohio last weekend to celebrate my niece's graduations from high school. And we are excited to be back now opening God's Word together with you. Well, do you ever really remember the first time that you feasted? You know, my parents might quibble with me about this, but the first time I really remember feasting, I was in 5th grade. We were living in Kentucky, and I got introduced to a new restaurant. It was called Mr. Gotti's. And any of you heard of Mr. Gotti's? It's kind of a southern thing. It's not your Italian grandpa. Imagine, though, that you took the buffet of Pizza Ranch and the games of Chuck E. Cheese and kind of smashed them together into one restaurant. Now, I was actually told after first service that Pizza Ranch is getting this idea, and they're introducing Fun Zone because they understand what a great concept this is. But here I was, around 11 years old, introduced to this restaurant, and I remember walking through the pizza buffet line again and again, and I have the spiritual gift of eating, so I was able to really minister to that buffet. And I think it was like 12 to 15 slices of pizza that I put away before I retired to, go play games and work it all off. It was the most amazing experience. Well, do you know that the Bible has a lot to say about feasting? We're headed to a feast. One day, Jesus is going to kick off eternity, the new creation, with the wedding feast of the Lamb. And here in John chapter 6, we get a preview of that feast. And Jesus is going to miraculously feed thousands up on a mountain, and it's the only miracle that's mentioned in all 4 Gospels. John's gospel uses this miracle in a unique way to set up this chapter. Jesus provides food to hungry people so that he can then teach the people that he is the bread of life. He is the food that we really need. And Jesus hosts a feast like any good king should and provides generously for his people. 3 points that we're going to see this morning from this passage, the opening story of John 6 chapter. I'm just going to give you the outline in advance this morning. You're not going to have to wait to fill in the blanks. Here they are. Jesus is qualified to be king. Jesus is a generous king, and Jesus is not the kind of king you'd expect. Now you've got your outline filled in. You can go ahead and just lock in as we walk through the passage. Let's read the first 9 verses as we dive into that first point. How do we learn that Jesus is qualified to be king? Here's the passage. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Hey Philip, where are we to buy bread so these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread wouldn't be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" To understand what John's doing in this story that he's writing about Jesus, we have to kind of see how chapter 6 fits in with chapter 5 that's just come before. So the end of chapter 5 is all about Moses, right? So let's look back at those last 2 verses. It says this: "If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for Moses wrote about me. But if you don't believe Moses' writings, how will you believe my words?" And so Jesus has this Moses setup, and he's challenged the people like, you should see that I am the fulfillment of what Moses was. And so his 6th chapter is going to kick off with Jesus repeating and surpassing 2 of the most famous miracles that Moses ever performed. Moses, through God's power, provided manna for the people. Jesus is going to miraculously reproduce food to feed the people. Moses led the people to walk through the waters of the Red Sea that God parted. Jesus is going to walk across the water, on top of the water, to get to the other side. In fact, John, the gospel writer, so wants us to be thinking Moses vibes that he just drops subtle hints about Moses all through the setup. Like the 9 verses that we read were all the setup to the miracle. And so as John's setting the stage, he's just like, hey, there's a little Moses in here. There's a little Now, each of these references to Moses by itself might not prove the point, but all of them together kind of give off strong Moses vibes. So let's kind of trace the Moses echoes in the text. 5 of them, 5 clues that this passage is reminding us of Moses. The first one is there was a large crowd following Jesus. Now, how does that remind us of Moses? Because when Moses led the people out of Egypt in the Exodus itself tells us that a large crowd followed Moses out of Egypt. So a crowd following both guys. Here's the second one. Jesus performed signs. That's why the crowd was following him here in John chapter 6 and verse 2. But what was Moses known for? Moses performed 10 signs. That's the word that was used in the Old Testament for what Moses did. We call them plagues now, but the Bible actually called them the 10 signs. Next, Jesus, where'd he go? He went up on a mountain. Where'd Moses go when the people were in the desert? Well, he went up on a mountain, right? And when he went up on the mountain, he received the law when God took his finger and carved the law into some tablets of stone. So Jesus is going where Moses went. Here's the fourth clue. It was Passover. Passover, the greatest religious holiday of the Jewish people. Now remember what Passover was, right? Passover started during the 10th sign that Moses was performing, the death of the firstborn throughout all Egypt. Moses was told by God, I'm going to send the angel of death. He's going to strike down the firstborn in every Egyptian home. But there can be something done so the angel of death will pass over your home, take the blood of a lamb and paint the doorposts of your home, and the angel of death will pass right over. And that's indeed what the people of God did. They painted their doors, and the angel of death passed over. And every year from then on, they remembered the miracle that God had done by celebrating the Passover. Moses began the first Passover by instituting that sign, and it was Passover again. Last vibe, giving off Moses echoes, was in verse 6. And Jesus calls to Philip, and he's like, hey, Philip, where are we going to find food for these people? I don't think Jesus was actually intending Philip to answer that question. I think Jesus knew what he was going to do, but he was testing him. And that word test was actually the same Greek word used in Hebrews chapter 3. And Hebrews chapter 3 is like a retrospective about Israel in the desert after they left Egypt. And Hebrews 3 tells us that God put his people in the desert to test them. So just as God's people were tested in the desert, so Philip was tested by Jesus here. So all of those things together give off Moses vibes. And you might be sitting there thinking, okay, cool, you've proved your point, but why exactly does that matter? What does this have to do with Jesus being qualified to be king, which is the first point of this outline that we're talking about? Like, was Moses ever called king? Was Moses ever called king? Do you remember that in the Old Testament? I'm going to invite you, because this is kind of an obscure reference. Let's put on our go-go gadget investigative glasses, and let's Sherlock together all the way back to Deuteronomy chapter 33. And here's what we read in Deuteronomy chapter 33. Moses gave us instruction, a possession for the assembly of Jacob, so he became king. Moses was called king of God's people back in Deuteronomy. And Jesus is worthy to assume Moses' mantle of authority because he would repeat and surpass Moses' miracles. Now we can unpack the story because you know what John is doing, how he's showing that Jesus is qualified to be the kind of king that Moses was. So the story kind of kicks off in verse 1 with the geographical setting. We're told that this takes place by the Sea of Galilee. And then John tells us, oh, by the way, that's the Sea of Tiberias. And just in case you're wondering why John is telling people why the sea has two names, back in 20 A.D., Herod, who was the king at the time, but we don't like him, right? Herod, boo, like he was kind of a lame guy. But he was brown-nosing the Roman emperor, and the Roman emperor at the time was named Tiberius. And so he's like, hey, I'm going to put signs around this sea that you've called the Sea of Galilee for generations and rename it after the Roman emperor so that he'll like me more. And so by the time John's gospel was written, about 50 years after the events that were described here in this passage, everybody knew the sea by this new Roman name, Tiberias. And so John wanted the people who were reading his gospel to know, hey, we called it the Sea of Galilee, but y'all won't understand what sea I'm talking about unless I tell you that you would know it as the Sea of Tiberias. So anyways, that's what's going on. So we get the idea that Jesus is motoring away from the crowds. He's not getting away from the crowds for the same reasons we would get away from crowds, right? Like, we want to get away from the crowds because our social battery has drained to zero, and we just need to pull away and introvert for a little while. Not Jesus. He was fully able to engage with the crowds and share God's message with them, but he wanted to pull away to take time, as was his custom, to pray. And as Jesus retreats to pray, getting away from these feeble, fickle, sometimes faithless followers, the crowd's chasing him down. So it says that they actually followed him to the other side of the lake. So if you look at the map, right, like Jesus was probably in Galilee and the crowd's hunting him down. So he actually goes all the way around the lake, and he's on the northeast side of the lake when this story takes place. You see up there it says Bethsaida and Hippus, and he was probably somewhere in between those towns. And the crowd is hunting him down because they know Jesus as the sign man, the miracle man, and they want Jesus to keep doing these healing miracles. So I'm just picturing them hunting him down like we want a miracle. Maybe they were chanting like, miracle, miracle. Like they were just like, Jesus, we need you to keep doing these miracles. And as the tension's kind of building up, will Jesus do a miracle for this crowd or not? Then John busts out another Moses reference in verse 4, the chronology, the time of this, and he says, by the way, it was Passover. Now, John's gospel was actually oriented around 3 Passovers. Passover is a holiday, right? It happens once a year. The reason most scholars think that Jesus' earthly ministry lasted for 3 years is because of this here in the Gospel of John. There were 3 Passovers, so thus 3 years of Jesus' ministry. The first Passover happened way back in John chapter 2. You remember that when Jesus cleaned out the temple and he was proving that he was the true temple, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. That was Passover number 1. This now is Passover number 2. So we're only in John chapter 6, but we're already halfway at the midpoint of Jesus' ministry. Passover number 3 is going to take place at the end of John's gospel when Jesus goes to the cross as the true Passover lamb. But this is the second Passover. Now, remember what I said, that Passover was the highest holy holiday for the Jewish people. It was one of a few Jewish holidays when all adult males were required to travel to Jerusalem to be in the presence of God to celebrate the holiday in the place where God dwelt, that is, in the vicinity of the temple. So isn't it fascinating that these people are not in Jerusalem? These men, instead of rushing to the temple in Jerusalem, are rushing to Jesus, the true temple, because the presence of God is now concentrated in a person, the embodied Son of God, not in a physical place any longer. So the Passover crowd is going to the true Passover lamb, the one who is the presence of God wherever he goes. And Jesus has been doing miracles The crowd's been following him. They recognize that Jesus is special. He's going up on a mountain. He's like Moses. And so John's got quite the setup here because I want you to remember, right? Like when Moses went up on the mountain, he got the law, but like big things happened when Moses went up on the mountain, right? Like there was flashes of lightning and peals of thunder, and don't touch the mountain or you might die. And God revealed himself in a powerful way. And so if Jesus is assuming Moses' mantle of authority and he's going to the place where this incredible thing happened for Moses, do you see how John's kind of like stirring up the expectation? Something big is about to happen. And just as something big is about to happen, and we're reading the text, like, what's it going to be? What incredible miracle is he going to perform? Some dude in the crowd pipes up, and he's like, did you hear that? That was my tummy. And he looks at the guy next to him, and he's like, hey, did you pack something to eat? I was busy following Jesus. Did you pack something to eat? He's like, I've been spending the whole morning on my iPhone. I've got this cool tracking thing, like Find My iPhone, and I've got Jesus' iPhone in here, and I'm just like going wherever he goes. We're just going to chase him all the way around the lake. And I was, you got food? Anybody got food? Bellies are rumbling. And Jesus looks at Philip, and he's like, hey, Philip, why don't you help us out? Now, why Philip? Philip was from a hometown very close to this region. Of all the 12, Philip had the closest personal roots to the place where they were hanging out. And so Jesus asked Philip about getting some food for the people. And he was trying to get Philip to display some faith, but Philip just starts doing math problems in his head. And he's like, okay, let's count the people, right? And it says that there were 5,000 men. Notice it doesn't tell us how many women and children there were. So when it tells, we know this story is like the feeding of the 5,000. But if you actually count all the people that were there and don't just do the man-centered way of looking at history, like you're probably talking, 10, 12,000 people? Like this is a massive group of people. So Philip's counting up all his money. And he's like, listen, if I had 200 denarii, you're like, I don't know that currency. Well, a denarius was 1 day wage. So imagine 200 days worth of wages. So roughly 2/3 of an annual salary. So in our terms, he'd be saying, bro, if I had $40,000 and I went to the nearest marketplace, I couldn't get enough food for every person to get just one bite. Probably even less now that we have inflation here in 2023, but I'm just saying. So everybody's hungry. Nobody's got food. Then Andrew shows up. Now, Andrew's been busy. Like, I got to commend this guy for being proactive and trying to figure things out. So while Philip's over here trying to count up math facts, Andrew's been crowdsourcing. Like, he's been walking around like, hey, you got anything? You got anything? You got anything? And he comes back to Jesus, and he reports the findings. He's like, hey, I know it's not much, but I found one little dude, and he's got a Lunchable. That's all he had. 5 loaves of barley and 2 little fish. Now, when you hear loaf, like you think about what you would find in the grocery store, right? And you're like, okay, a loaf of bread could at least feed 3 people, maybe? Not that kind of loaf. When they say loaf, they mean like a mini pita thing. Like if you took a pita bread thing and you took a ring mold and you popped out just a tiny little piece of that, that's what barley was. Barley, by the way, on a scale of 1 to tasting good, nasty. In fact, there was a historian from that time named Philo. Check out what Philo says about barley. This is awesome. He said, barley is a foodstuff of somewhat doubtful merit. It's suited for irrational animals and men in unhappy circumstances. Jesus is getting ready to provide a feast, and he's got a little barley. Yum. But there were also 2 little fish. These would be like little sardines that they would chop up and use to flavor these barley cakes so that people who had to eat them would at least have some decent flavor as they ate them. So that's what we got, these tiny cakes and these tiny fish. Also important to note at this point, did you know barley has a biblical history of being the bread that was used in miracles? And check it out, back in 2 Kings chapter 4, we read a story about Elisha. And it says a man came from Baal Shalishah, bringing Elisha, the man of God, bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley, and fresh ears of grain in his sack. And Elisha said, "Give to the men that they may eat." But his servant said, "How can I set this before 100 men?" So 20 loaves, 100 dudes. So he replied, "Give them to the men that they may eat, for thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left." So he set it before them, and they ate and had some left, according to the word of the Lord. So Elisha was one of the greatest miracle-working prophets of the people of Israel. And one of his greatest miracles was taking 20 loaves of barley and feeding 100 guys. From a little food, he fed a large crowd. I don't know if you've done proportions recently, but 20 loaves for 100 guys versus 5 loaves for 12,000 people. Do you see what Jesus is doing? He's repeating and blowing away Elisha's miracle. He's showing that he is a greater miracle worker than Elisha. He's a greater king than Moses. All of this to show that Jesus is qualified to be king. Now we're ready to move on to the second part of the story that shows us that Jesus is a generous king. Let's read the next few verses. Verse 10, Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in that place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. So, Passover, this holiday, was in the spring. So I want you to think about grass, right? I mean, even here in Minnesota, after the summer sun beats down in July and August, you, unless you spend a lot of money to water your grass, have brown, brittle, pointy grass. And have you ever sat on that grass and it's kind of like sitting on needles and it's like not awesome? Well, imagine what would happen in the summer in Israel, way closer to the equator than we are here in Minnesota. So it was spring. That's an important note because the grass was still green and lush for the people to sit on. Well, Jesus was fulfilling prophecy. He was fulfilling the Old Testament here. Do you have any idea what passage of the Old Testament Jesus was fulfilling by having the people sit down on green grass? Some of you learned this verse in Awana. You should know this. I'll give you a hint. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. You know it. He makes me lie down in green pastures. Jesus, the good shepherd, is having his people sit down in lush green pastures. And then the miracle happens in verse 11. Pretty short and sweet how the text describes it. He took the loaves, he prayed, he distributed them, they ate as much as they wanted. That's the miracle. But the fulfillment is of Isaiah chapter 25. Here's the prediction of the prophet. On this mountain, remember Jesus went up on a mountain? On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine, well refined. Jesus took a questionable food source and he gave everyone as much as they could want to eat. And it was a preview of that day when the Messiah, predicted in Isaiah chapter 25, would bring about the end times feast that would kick off the new creation of eternity. He was surpassing what Moses did. When Moses provided manna for the people, they were only allowed to gather what they could use each day. Remember, if they tried to gather up leftovers, it would rot overnight. But Jesus was doing more than Moses. The point was, Jesus wasn't just providing them enough to live. He was fully satiating their hunger. In that culture, food was incredibly hard to come by. The people who were sitting on that mountain east of that sea, they'd have been used to waking up every day wondering, where am I going to eat? What am I going to eat? And they'd be spending their whole day chasing down food. If there was food left over, they'd have a whole day where they wouldn't have to worry about what they were going to eat. What an incredible thing that would be. And Jesus is providing leftovers to show that as a king, he provides abundantly and generously like any good king should. I mean, think about it. Anytime Jesus hosts, he gives way more than you can imagine. You remember the first time when Jesus provided back in John chapter 2? He was at a wedding, right? They were running out of wine. And they asked Jesus, what are we going to do? We're running out of wine. Jesus like, got ya. And he's like, just give me a little water. And he turns the water into wine. And the guy in charge who's emceeing the event, he's like, bro, why'd you hide the best stuff for last? And there was abundant drink. Just as there was abundant drink provided by Jesus in chapter 2, there's now abundant food provided by Jesus here in chapter 6. Jesus, this is the point, gives you everything you need. Whatever you need, Jesus supplies. He provides for his people richly, lavishly, abundantly, like a king. He gave them bread because bread is what gives you life. And then Jesus would look at them and say, I am the bread of life. Everything we need, Jesus gives us. And how does he give it to us? He gives it to us by giving himself. When we take communion, and we take a piece of bread into ourselves, what we're really saying is, Jesus, I need you. Jesus, I need to receive all that you are. I accept everything that you've given to me. And I allow you to come inside of me. And I take you into my life that you might redefine who I am and how I'm supposed to live. See, here's how Jesus gives us himself. He takes our identity, sinful, shamed, all the stuff we've done in our past, and he takes it to the cross, and wearing our junk, Jesus died on the tree. But then Jesus unites us with him in the grave of death so that we can be united with him when 3 days later he walked out of the grave. And we have been resurrected with him. We take all of that into ourselves and we say, Jesus, I need you to be my sin taker and my sin killer so that in you I can be a new life liver, a salvation receiver, a new creation participant. If anyone is in Christ, they are a new creation. The old is gone. The new has come. Vertical Worship sings this song. I don't need the riches of this world. I can't even take them where I'm going. I don't need 1,000 empty words. I just need the ones that you have spoken. If I have you and nothing else, I have everything. How richly Jesus has provided for us. And yet, we live in a world where there is competition for what we will truly seek, for what bread we will truly desire. The world says, here is what you need. I think of another song by Caveman's Call. It says, this world has nothing for me, and this world has everything. All that I could want, and nothing that I need. But isn't that what the world's saying? Here's what you need. You need this. Your life won't be fulfilled without that. And fill in that blank. What is it for you? I must have this. I'm chasing this. Everything that will satisfy me is this. Oh, all the things that the world tells us we need. money, travel, free time, good food, pleasure, success, fame, healing, the perfect family. And we chase one of those things or many of those things, and it becomes the focus of our life. And I must have this. And Jesus meets us in the middle of that chase, and he says, you can have me. And if you have me, you'll stop chasing all those other things. Because even if you find those things, you'll find that they can't fully satisfy you forever. But if you have Jesus, you have everything that you could ever need. Jesus says, I come to give you myself. If you trust in Jesus now, if you receive Jesus now, if you take Jesus into yourself now, you will share the blessings and benefits of the new creation. You'll have a spot reserved for you in that one day coming feast that Jesus will prepare for all eternity for his people. But if you reject Jesus to chase after something else, you'll have no share in that new creation. Such a pivotal choice placed before us. Do you want Jesus? Or are you chasing something else that this world offers? Oh, can you hear the invitation that John is writing through this story? Oh, that you would come to Jesus and be satisfied. Oh, that you would come to Jesus and find in him everything you need. But there's one final detail as the miracle begins to wrap down. It says that they collected 12 basketfuls full of leftovers. And if you've been following along as we've talked through this story, you might be thinking, it seems like almost every detail in this story has a deeper meaning. And so maybe you're asking, you know what, Pastor, is there some meaning about why there were 12 basketfuls left over? I'm so glad you asked. Yes, there is a deeper meaning. Check this out. Here's how the early church understood it. Thousands of years ago, near the time of Christ, there was a writing from the early Christian church called the Didache. And here's what they wrote about this miracle. Even as what was broken was scattered over the hills and was gathered together and became one, so let your church be gathered together from the ends of the earth into your kingdom. See, here's how the number 12 worked in the Bible, right? Remember, the nation of Israel was organized around 12 tribes? And you had your identity by belonging to the people of God, identifying with one of those 12 tribes. But then the exile happened and those 12 tribes were scattered all over the world. How was Jesus going to reconstitute the people of God? How was Jesus going to bring back the people of God from every corner of creation? He was going to use 12 apostles to regather the scattered 12 tribes. But those who were gathered would no longer be gathered on the basis of their blood connection to the nation of Israel, their DNA. But they'd be gathered on the basis of their faith connection to God, their spiritual DNA. Do you believe in Jesus Christ? Do you receive Jesus Christ? And do you see the picture? If you belong to Jesus, wherever you are, wherever you've been, whatever you've done, you get gathered into those baskets that are the people of God. You get a place in the family of God, and you've RSVP'd for your spot in eternity for all the blessings that God has prepared. What a beautiful promise. People started to get the idea that Jesus was a king. 2 last verses to make our final point that Jesus wasn't the kind of king you'd expect. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet." Moses had said, "There's a prophet like me coming," in Deuteronomy 18:15. So the people finally got it. This is the prophet who is to come into the world. Verse 15. Perceiving then that they were about to come and make him king by force, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. How can you make someone king by force? Like if you're like, "Hey, we want you to be king," and they're like, "Yeah, I decline." How can you be like, "No, you're king anyways. Like we're making you king"? Well, here's what they would do. They would declare that Jesus was their king, and then they would start a campaign of guerrilla warfare against the Roman Empire. And Rome wouldn't care if Jesus was wearing a crown, if Jesus was part of this plot, if Jesus supported this revolution. They wouldn't care about any of that. They would have just heard, these people are calling Jesus king, and they're going around doing all these destructive things in our empire. We can quash this whole thing if we kill Jesus. So by force was, hey, Jesus, we're calling you our king. We're doing all these things in your name, and Rome's going to kill you either way, so you might as well step up and help us, because at least you'll have a chance to survive if this revolution's successful. That's king by force. And so Jesus pieces out. Now, why? If Jesus was king, why not accept the crown? Why not claim the throne? Why not defeat Rome? Because Jesus wasn't playing the game of thrones that's been played by every human empire from the dawn of creation. What's won by force must be maintained by force. What's won by force must be continued through control and power and violence and domination. And the only way to keep power that you've gained by force is to use the weapons of this world. Swords, shields, clubs, and guns. But when you use the weapons of this world to defeat the kings of this world, you're using the tools that the one who has temporary authority in this world has given us. In Revelation, we're told that that person is called the dragon, the ancient serpent, Satan. If you use Satan's tools to try and win a battle against Satan and evil forces in this world, you've already lost. King Jesus only had two weapons that he used. He never used a sword. He never used a gun. His weapons were love and sacrifice. His throne was a cross. Only on that instrument of execution was he raised in exaltation. He was only declared king through a sign that hung above his thorn-pierced, bleeding brow that declared, this is the King of the Jews. And what they hung in mockery, God used to declare Jesus' glory. But Jesus won by losing in the battle of force in this world. Jesus won by yielding himself to the cross so that there he could take our sin, so that he could identify us with him in his death and his resurrection. And only by allowing the forces of evil to thrust all evil onto himself did Jesus quash evil finally, fully, and forever. Jesus' kingdom wasn't of this world. So some people came and they tried to make Jesus another worldly king. And Jesus said, I've got something far, far better in store for you. And what was that? It was his broken body and his shed blood. And we take communion together so that we can remember the victory of Jesus on the cross. We can remember that Jesus alone is the true bread of life that we need.